Azure resources are, in a nutshell, everything. Well, almost everything. Let's take a look. So, what actually defines a resource within Azure? So, when we see these terms written out in Microsoft documentation or perhaps in a certification exam question, we'll understand exactly what they're referring to, so there's no gray area. This is pretty simply outlined by a couple of key attributes of the resources that are identified as such in the big list of services and offerings and widgets and doodads and all the other cool stuff that Microsoft has up in Azure. So if you ask yourself if the service or offering in front of you in Azure can do one of these things or one of these things applies to it, then you can safely assume it's a resource, and anything that's talking about resources would then be applicable to it. That would be if it can be managed, which is just another way of saying administrated. Can it be configured? And can it be deployed? If in the context of thinking about that particular object or service in Azure, if you can say it is something that you would manage or administrate, something that you would configure, or something you would deploy, if that sounds like something that makes sense, then you're safely assuming that any documentation that says Azure resource, it's talking about that thing. Now, I can tell you that what the common perspective is amongst, shall we say, newer or getting to know Azure administrators is that when they go and deploy resources and they start clicking buttons and pushing services out into their respective subscriptions, they're basically just going to wait till they see the bill. And anything that has on the bill as a line item, any charge, is obviously some sort of resource and should be considered as such. I would just recommend that you have a good idea as to what is actually a resource when you click a button or you add it to a script, so that you do know if you're going to have a bill. No surprises in the billing department is one of the best ways to go about life. Now, in the world of Azure resources, there are two absolutes. You're always going to have a subscription, which is to say the resource resides within it. That's one way of looking at it, but it's more like the resources associated with it, because you can pretty easily move resources between subscriptions most of the time for most resources. But there is a subscription related or associated with any resource. There's also always going to be an RG, a resource group. We will talk more about RGs here in about a video or two. We'll have a dedicated conversation about those folks there. But both of these are always going to be present on anything that is considered an Azure resource. If you attempt to create a resource of any kind without both of these pieces of information, well, you can. The wizard will obviously just fail to complete. And if you try to do it with any kind of script like the ARM JSON templates, they'll just error out during the PowerShell process because of the verification built in to the Azure Resource Manager. What's that, you say? The Azure Resource Manager? It's not the most glamorous or exciting piece of technology in the Azure cloud, but it is definitely one of the most useful. The Azure Resource Manager, and we were just talking about, right, some of the requirements to have an Azure resource successfully deployed or created and configured within the Azure cloud. You're going to have these requirements, and then as you get further down the list of each individual type of resource, like virtual machines or virtual networks, you're going to have other information or other bits of configuration that are required to successfully deploy it. And the Azure Resource Manager is here to do that checking for us. So as we have the greater cloud in Azure, and we have our individual resources scattered about, databases and applications and virtual servers and all the good stuff, and each of these is going to look back towards a central point, which is still within the greater cloud over there at Microsoft, but it's outside of the area that you personally manage as an administrator, and actually resides within Microsoft's portion of the infrastructure, right? Outside of anything you would ever directly configure. The ARM is where all of these resources come to look for their most basic instructions, including during the tasks while they're being deployed and created. Additionally, the ARM is also the gateway for all of our management tools to connect to, like our scripting tools and our UIs, and even the Azure portal itself. So the ARM, while again is not necessarily the flashiest or most glamorous of technologies, it's critical in that it is that junction between all of our resources and how we manage them. Okay, now we've got one of those like most awful of learning experiences, but we have an absolute hard requirement right here to memorize something in order to be successful on the AZ900. There are not a lot of these because this is a define and describe sort of certification experience. Not necessarily what do you got in your memory about how this works inside and out. But it is very critical that you understand how the Azure Resource Manager works and what its general purpose capabilities are as it relates to Azure resources. So we're going to list them out here, define each one, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Don't be concerned. And then I would recommend that you go forth with whatever flashcard system or whatever it is that works best for you individually to just kind of like ingrain your head. This is what the ARM can do to everything as a general purpose baseline. We've got 8 listed here. They're not too complicated, I don't think. Create. Obviously, we need to be able to create the resource. Name, that isn't necessarily the name that the Azure Resource Manager is going to use. That's probably going to be a big old giant GUID of numbers and letters and whatnot, right? But the name can be something that's used for cosmetic purposes. It depends on the resource. Rename, obviously, most names can be changed, and this is a function that the ARM serves to do. Delete the resource. Well, what can be made can be unmade. And then the more complicated configuration specific to all resources and unique to Azure. These ones are going to be the more complicated ones to commit to memory. And it's specified to 3 changes and a modify. We can change, and it needs to always be able to change the resource group and the subscription and the tags, as well as modify role-based access control. So these 8 items, however best works for you, want to be armed with those in your mind when you go to take the test. Azure Resources and the Azure Resource Manager. Pretty much all the stuff in Azure and how we deploy, configure, and administrate it after we decide to release it into the Azure cloud. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.